Welcome to Sharp Insights, Conversations with Your Plan Giving Experts, a podcast for development professionals. Whether you're new to the field or looking to enhance your existing program, we will provide practical tips, expert advice, and real-world stories to deepen your understanding of plan giving. If you're committed to securing long-term support for your nonprofit, you've come to the right place.
Welcome to Sharp Insights, Conversations with Your Plan Giving Experts. I'm your host, Grant Miller. For nonprofits, trust is everything. Donors aren't simply purchasing a product or service. They're entering into what may become a long-term relationship with your organization, expecting you to steward resources wisely, communicate honestly, protect their private information, and most importantly, remain committed to your mission. In an era of AI-generated content, increasingly sophisticated scams, data breaches, and automation tools that personalize outreach on a massive scale, that trust relationship is changing rapidly. We're here today with Rasheeda Childress and M.J. Prest. Rasheeda is the senior editor for fundraising at the Chronicle of Philanthropy. M.J. is the senior editor for solutions at the Chronicle of Philanthropy, where she highlights how nonprofit leaders navigate and overcome major challenges. Today, we're going to focus on how technology has reshaped donor expectations, the risks organizations face when technology undermines authenticity, and how nonprofits can maintain and rebuild donor trust in an increasingly digital world. Rasheeda and MJ, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Yes, thanks for having us.
MJ, let's start with you. So for starters, how does donor trust differ from, say, client or customer trust? And what makes the nonprofit relationship both uniquely fragile and uniquely powerful?
Yeah, so I think with a customer's relationship with a business, that's about a customer buying a product. If it disappoints, then they just switch brands. There's no real affinity or loyalty there. Whereas a donor is really buying belief. They're giving you money for something they may never directly see or use or benefit from. And that's certainly even more true for a bequest. There's no return policy on a charitable gift. So that is what makes the relationship uniquely fragile, because any kind of breach, a scandal, a tone-deaf appeal, any sort of misuse of that money, that can damage that trust permanently, because the donor's only product was their confidence in you. But that's also what makes it powerful, because customers don't leave businesses in their will. They don't tell their friends largely about how excited they are about a product. Sometimes they do, but donors certainly do. And I think especially, when you're thinking about plan giving or any sort of long-term fundraising relationship, there's a depth of commitment there that a consumer relationship doesn't generally produce. There's also a much longer time horizon because, we're talking about decades-long relationships in a lot of cases. And I think finally, it's that donors expect to be participants. They are not just consumers of a charity. They want to have a voice. They want to see transparency about the impact of their gift. And that's a relationship that compounds over time with proper stewardship techniques. So, I think those expectations have largely shifted, which makes the trust question kind of trickier now than it was 20 years ago.
Do you have any concrete examples of ways that you've seen, trust compromised in nonprofit organizations? And what might that look like? What should we look out for?
Ooh, yeah. So I'm going to get into this a little bit later too, but there have certainly been organizations that have been targeted by scammers. Their donors have been defrauded. And that's an area where you have to be very transparent. There was one organization that spoke to one of our reporters, Libby Sander, that wanted to remain anonymous in our reporting, but they couldn't remain anonymous to the donors that were defrauded. It was an animal welfare charity out of Pennsylvania that had a public list on Venmo of who their donors were, and those donors were targeted by a scammer and asked for donations that they couldn't recover.
Okay. So we'll get more into that later, but giving us some things to be on the lookout for. So, Rasheeda, for you, how have donor expectations regarding trust changed in the last 5, 10, 15 years? Do you think donors are more skeptical or cautious today than they used to be?
Yeah, I think generally trust has sort of cratered in the past 5, 10, 15 years. For example, the Pew Research Center did a study of trust, and they found in 2024 that trust in the federal government was down to like 22%, which was very low compared to, like, say, the year 2000 when it was hovering around 50%. Similarly, people don't trust other individuals. Only 34% of people told Pew that most other people could be trusted. So that sort of general distrust kind of bleeds into nonprofits. And then it doesn't help when you have scandals involving nonprofits where funds are misdirected or they're not used as they said. And just recently, a California judge banned Cars for Kids jingle or advertisement in California, saying it was deceptive because many listeners believed the funds were going to needy and underprivileged kids, when the reality was that most of the funds were used by a religious charity to fund trips to Israel. And so what donors really are concerned about and really want is transparency. They're happy to give to many things. They have a lot of different interests and they want to give to those interests. But what they don't want is to feel like they're being tricked or they're being misled. And when you have a lot of cases about donors feeling like they've been bamboozled or tricked, that mistrust, it trickles down to other nonprofits, whether they deserve it or not. And there was a poll by the Better Business Bureau Wise Giving Alliance, and they do surveys on donor trust. And they said that donors look for 3 things when it comes to trust. The first is, how does the charity spend its money? The second is the charity truthful, accurate, and not misleading? And the third thing is whether or not the charity protects its donor information. And I think for charities who are doing planned giving, that first thing, how the charity spends its money, is going to be really crucial in building your trust, because people who are doing a planned gift, they are thinking about legacy. They're thinking about how their gift is going to matter 10, 15, 20 years from now. And so they want an organization that is very strong in its finances and will be around for 10, 15, 20, hopefully 50, 100 years. And so I think that's a key area to focus on.
In the study that you mentioned, what are some of the reasons for this erosion of trust over the last few years? Was that touched on?
I think the main thing is just there's been a lot of sort of corruption and scandals in the news, and people just give more weight to that than it deserves. You know, when you see something, you think it's going on more prevalently than it is. And so we just have from Watergate on, we've had just a lot of people investigating and finding out things that are about corruption and misuse of funds. And when those things happen, people hear about it and they start to worry sometimes. So I think that's one of the big reasons.
Okay. I don't imagine the emergence of social media showing us all the worst of ourselves sometimes has really helped a lot either. But that's a whole different podcast for sure. Speaking of technology has clearly improved things in fundraising in many ways: personalization, automation, analytics, donor management, CRMs, and that sort of thing. Is there anything that we've potentially lost in this process?
Yeah, I feel like we've lost a lot of personality in that fundraiser-donor relationship. It's almost ironic because personalization tools actually often produce something that feels more generic precisely because it's been so optimized. If every donor gets a personalized email at 9:15 on a Monday morning, they kind of all start to blend together. I think another thing that we've lost is patience. Technology rewards speed and scale, but something like planned giving or a major gift strategy, that rewards the opposite. Those require high-touch relationships, decades of consistency, and it really takes 8 to 10 years between that first touch point. That's what the research says, that first touch point with a potential planned gift donor and when that bequest becomes realized, that's a long time horizon for leadership to want to invest in over the long haul. They want quarterly metrics, and that's just not super compatible with certain types of fundraising strategies. And what we were just talking about, it's that trust in the people doing the work. And I think it's worth noting that there are attacks on charities coming from the federal level that decrease trust in the people actually doing this work. But there's also an element of wanting to control fundraiser language in the organizational level. So in a story that I recently edited by Michael Wasserman, who is the CEO of Tiltify, a peer-to-peer technology platform, he talked about how nonprofits are often using technology to control peer-to-peer fundraisers by requiring them to use templates, having mandatory language, requiring approval from somebody higher up. But that isn't super productive on the fundraiser side, because we understand that the intent is to protect the brand, but you really want to empower fundraisers to be able to speak authentically and with their own personality, their own voice, and talk to their audience in the way that their audience is most likely to respond well to that information. Because especially younger donors, audiences really easily detect inauthenticity. And then finally, I think it's also just a little bit of that gut instinct for fundraisers, because when you have everything neatly packaged in your CRM, there isn't as much of a need to develop those fundraising instincts that used to really drive results, because a CRM isn't going to necessarily tell you who is grieving a loved one or who just retired, which is kind of its own sort of grief because of that transition. And those are the moments that people redo their wills. So you still need to have that EQ, that emotional quotient, and data fields don't really necessarily capture all of that.
EQ, emotional quotient. I like that. I haven't heard that. I'm going to start using that.
I can't take credit for it. I did not make that one.
That's pretty good. So yeah, there's nothing in terms of stewarding donors. There's not really any technology that's going to replace that nuanced human element of actually knowing your donors and responding and engaging with them accordingly. But for organizations who are continuing to strategically invest in technology for planned giving, where are we seeing success in engagement and returns in long-term gifts?
Yeah, so I wrote a deep dive into Alsac St. Jude's planned giving strategy. This story idea actually came from Andy Fussner, who's a friend of the pod, who called St. Jude, the shining beacon on the hill in terms of their planned giving strategy. They've raised $4.5 billion in bequests over the past 10 years, and that includes $800 million last year alone, actually more than $800 million. So none of that came from automation. A lot of that just came from long-term investment in somewhat unglamorous infrastructure. They were pairing that high-touch stewardship with nearly obsessive data tracking, really granular stuff, knowing when a donor first engaged, what they care about, who they've spoken to, what they spoke about. That goes on for decades in some cases. But they're not using that technology, their configurations, to drive the personal relationships. They're allowing their CRM to get a new gift officer onboarded and pick up a 25-year relationship without missing a beat. That's worth so much more than using AI to draft a new appeal. Because again, a lot of the bequests that are maturing now were made 20 or 30 years ago, according to their data. That was kind of a very interesting look into how St. Jude is approaching it. That was like very intentional investment in their technology and where they're seeing payoff there. But there are other tools too. I wrote another story on DAF strategy, donor advised funds. And wealth screening software has come a long way. That's definitely an area where people may want to invest in some new platforms. So tools like iWave, Donor Atlas, Donor Search, people are using these to find planned giving prospects and major donor prospects that are hiding in their data. These are donors who probably already have sophisticated giving vehicles set up and are just looking for places to direct that money. So I would say the investments that don't pay off are the ones that try to take shortcuts. A perfectly written AI appeal with no real personality, going to a fundraising prospect that you've never met is just a faster way to lose them.
Okay, yeah. So St. Jude is at it again, apparently. It's funny growing up in Memphis, St. Jude was a part of, my experience there. And like many things in Memphis, you didn't really realize the ripple outward into the world until I think I moved to Washington State in my early 20s. And there was McDonald's was asking for money for St. Jude out there or something like that. So yeah. Anyway, so the downside, every so often, about once a week or so, I'll get some kind of notification that some password that I have for some website somewhere has been in a data leak. And we all know that data breaches and those sorts of things can severely damage donor confidence. And when a breach or something like that occurs, what separates organizations that regain trust from their donors than organizations who, we'll say, like might lose credibility long-term with their donors? And are there any examples of organizations specifically that have rebuilt that trust after scandal, skepticism, data breaches? And what do they do well? And what can we learn from them?
Yeah, that's a great question. What separates the good organizations from those that regain trust from those that don't regain trust is really just, it comes down to their actions. Those organizations that regain trust, they do what trustworthy people do. So Brene Brown, who's an author and does a lot of work in the psychology realm, talks about trust as the jar of marbles. And so the way you build trust in the first place is you fill your jar with marbles, one thing at a time. And so when you've got this full jar of marbles, that's trust. That's your trust. And when you break trust with a data breach, that whole jar just smashes on the floor and it's empty. And you got to get a new jar and you got to start from scratch. So the nonprofits that are doing this well, they're going to start with that first marble. And that first marble after a data breach is admitting what happened, right? So if donors find out from some other source that you had a data breach and you tried to hide it, you're just starting over and it's even more distrust. So the ones who do well, they start by saying, this is what happened. And then the second marble that they put in the jar is they apologize. They say, we're really sorry. We made a mistake. We messed up. We did something wrong. And we hope that you can forgive us. And that sort of third marble is like how they plan to repair it. This is what we're going to do differently. This is what caused us to lose trust. We sort of had this policy in place and it didn't work. They may go through and do some sort of audit to try to figure out exactly what happened if it isn't clear. And they'll tell people, we're going to have answers for you in 6 months or whenever, and we're going to keep you updated on the investigation. And these are the policies that we're putting in place. And so it's slowly building those things, those marbles, putting them back in the jar and trying to regain trust with your donors. And donors want, a lot of times, they just want an apology and they want to understand that we're human. We're not perfect. And so if something happens and the organization is taking responsibility for it and they're moving forward and they're telling donors what happened and they're telling them how they're going to correct it, that's a really good thing for them to do. It's also important with the data breach to follow state law because data breaches are covered by state law. So it's 50 different rules you're playing with. So you need to figure out what's going on in your state and follow what's supposed to happen in the state. Some nonprofit organizations are able to purchase identity protection for people if identifying information was stolen, if it was more sort of names and not your social security number and sort of really personal information, apologies and telling how it will be fixed is a good thing to do that a lot of nonprofits will do. The other thing, this isn't a data breach case, but in terms of an organization that did it well, I was at a conference a couple years ago and the CEO of Make-A-Wish Iowa talked about having had their former CEO embezzle from them. And they had to make decisions when they found out about the embezzlement because some people on their board wanted them to basically just push this person to the side and keep it quiet and not let donors know that they had had this huge mess. And they decided that they were going to prosecute it. But again, it becomes big news. It's lots of news stories. So people who are potentially going to donate to you are like, should I donate to this organization? And the CEO talked about how she had to go through and talk about this is how this mistake happened. We didn't have the proper sign-off procedures in place to keep someone from just funneling money to themselves. We've redone our procedures. We're doing all this. And they made a huge effort to just be open and transparent about the audit, about what they were doing different, talking to donors about that. And they had a lot of corporate donors. And so they went to their corporate donors, like the local businesses, people who come and give and participate and invite them in. They went to those people and they said, you're a business. You've had people steal from you. What do you do? And apparently that was a very effective tactic, just asking for advice. Like, what do you do as a business when this happens to you? And they got more donations because businesses, the leaders would say, hey, we know this happens. People steal from us. Put all these things in place and people steal from you. And so it turned out to work very well. And they were able to continue their fundraising and to regain the trust in the community. So I think if you're open, if you're honest, if you're transparent, and if you're genuine and tell people what's going on, you're going to have that success rebuilding trust.
It's so funny because so many of these, when we talk about donor trust and repair and things like that, so much of it comes back to what I tell my 8-year-old is just name it, own it, be honest about it, and take responsibility for it and move forward. So honesty is the best policy. Such a cliche, but I guess cliches are cliches sometimes because they're true.
I think also like a good apology really makes such a difference. And with my kids, I also do a game where we do good apology, bad apology. So if my son accidentally smacks my daughter, the bad apology, I'll make him do a bad apology just to make him laugh. And it'll be like, I'm sorry you ran into my fist, and that's a bad apology versus I'm sorry I hit you, which is, I didn't mean to. I won't do it again. That's a good apology. That's good too, because it's also important to be able to have awareness around what to do and what not to do. Simultaneously, it's really helpful. I'm sorry that happened, right? It doesn't usually work. But I'm sorry I played this role that hurt you. Yeah, very good. Very good. Well, just to pull the curtain back a little bit, preparing these podcasts, I write out some questions and then we have a back and forth with our guests about, the topics we make sure we want to talk about and maybe things that aren't relevant. And then one of these questions, I was interested in the idea of just looking ahead into the future about ways that nonprofits can use these technologies and how those relationships can be healthy. And initially I wrote 5 to 10 years, I think. And then some of the feedback was make it 6 to 12 months. I guess just real quickly, what's the importance of that distinction there? So I think it's really just the rate at which these tools, especially AI tools, are developing. You're seeing a lot of LLMs. The newest models are being coded by the LLMs. So the rate of change is really accelerating. I think it's also important to remember that the decisions the bequests that are coming due now were often made in 2005. So the choices that nonprofit groups are making now about what to invest in, they're going to be living with those tools for a while, potentially. So I think you need to stay a little bit nimble because of the way that these tools are changing. But it's also important, people don't really have the budget to switch tools every year. You have to be very careful, very diligent about the tools that you are committing to using, because those are going to be what's driving your results for the next couple of years, even if the payoff is more short term. That's interesting because it changes so quickly. And in this world where we're often looking ahead decades into the future to see results of the work that we're doing today, I imagine that can be really tricky because it's like every 2 or 3 months I'm asked to use some type of, not in just my work, but in everything. I'm like, oh, here's this new social media, here's this new platform, here's this new thing. And I guess first, where should organizations, draw the line between all of these technological bells and whistles and the things that planned giving has been getting right since day one? That's the human element. What does a healthy relationship between a nonprofit and the AI and the technology look like? What should we be looking to always evolve and change? And what should we keep the same? Yeah, so I think the healthiest orientation is give AI the labor that doesn't require human judgment and let humans do the work that does. So sure, a first version of an appeal or summarizing meeting notes or pulling a donor's giving history before you you schedule that meeting, that's totally appropriate and that's fine. But writing a condolence note or choosing how to respond to a complaint by a major donor, that's really not appropriate. And I think where you will see the dividing line between the nonprofits that are doing this well and the ones that aren't is that relational intelligence, that EQ that we talked about before. It's that ability to read a room, to know what's important to a donor, to hear what they're saying, to know when to make the ask and when it's really not appropriate. Just the small things that matter to that stewardship relationship. That's essentially AI proof. The organizations that are encouraging their staff to develop those skills will be in a much stronger position than the ones who are just cutting staff and letting AI take over all of these roles. I also think that healthy organizations will be publicly transparent and honest about how they are using in a way that's not just buried in a privacy policy. I mean, people never read privacy policies. Think about the last time you were asked to click OK on a terms and conditions, but just stated plainly somewhere prominent that we use AI for this, but we will never use it for that. And I think that kind of clarity is a trust signal in itself. I think the risk on the other side is that erosion, where every appeal sounds a little synthetic or every personal email looks like a template because donors are gradually going to lose interest in reading what you're sending them. You need to have that sense that there's a real human being on the other end of that relationship. And erosion is slow, but it's probably harder to recover from because once you've lost that trust, it's kind of gone.
So there are definitely certain areas of fundraising and stewarding where AI should not replace human interaction. Rasheeda, is there anything that you wanted to add to that?
Sure. I guess the one thing I would say is, when it comes to AI, to like MJ said, to think a lot about sort of disclosure and just also about what your values are as your organization, because that's what's going to matter. You need to talk to your stakeholders, the people at your nonprofit who make up the nonprofit, and think about how do we want to use AI? What do we want to tell people about using AI? And what do we want to disclose? I think if you're using one of the areas that it's really important to disclose, certainly for nonprofits where you can get a lot of pushback, is in images. Creating images with AI that donors think reflect what you've actually witnessed or seen. It's just highly problematic, and organizations get a lot of pushback from it. One organization, Amnesty International, back in 2023, they generated images of police brutality against protesters, and they said they were doing it to protect the identity of protesters who might get retaliation, but they didn't disclose it, and they got just a ton of negative feedback. And I think people would do that still today, even though we're 3 years later and people expect AI a lot more. You still need to disclose. And a really good example of disclosure is the Furniture Bank, which they're a Canadian charity, and they generated AI images for a fundraising campaign there. And the tagline was, "The picture isn't real, but the reality is." And what Furniture Bank does is they provide furniture to people who can afford rent, but nothing else. And so their home, people are sleeping on a big pile of clothing, or they use a milk crate for their tables. And it's just embarrassing and it feels uncomfortable. And they've never been able to get the people who accept their services to let them photograph their home to use in appeals. And so they generated images, but they told people to. And I think people can understand that there's a certain dignity that the people an organization serves want to have. And if you can allow them to maintain that dignity while still expressing their story, using images generated based on words that they've said and things that they've told you, then that is a perfectly acceptable way to use it. Just be clear when you're using it in ways that aren't typical. And some people will say, generating a first draft is maybe like spell check or something like that. Some people don't disclose every instance of it every time. And I think doing that can probably cause more harm than necessary. I think Vanderbilt University a few years back had a huge scandal when after there was a shooting at Michigan State University, and they did a condolences email saying, we're so sorry this happened. And to students, if you need help and support, all these things. And they ended it with that this was written by AI, and just received very negative feedback. So things like MJ was talking about, that emotional quotient, things that are uniquely human, like grief and condolences, and let me help you, those should be written by humans. And appending it with AI, that's just not going to serve your organization well.
So a general rule might be just keep the human things human. And apparently, another thread that's coming through is just be honest. Again, I'm sorry off the top of my head, I can't remember the organization, but using the generated images of police brutality, prove a point or push that. And then, it makes sense in the other circumstance where you might not want to exploit people or embarrass them, and to use AI generated images and just say, we're using AI generated images here. I get emails sometimes that will have a line in the front that says, yes, I can make this warmer in tone and more professional, where the person forgot to delete the line where the ChatGPT bot said or whatever. I just wrote a blog about the ways that large language models, AI, have hijacked the M dash. And those of us writers who've been using the M dash for years are just kind of gritting our teeth about it, because now they're saying like, if you see an M dash, that's a telltale sign that it might be AI or those sorts of things.
You can pull it from my cold dead hands, because I do love an M dash unapologetically.
Oh yeah, don't get me started. See, I can't even help but bring it up here. Yeah.
Just remember, you didn't copy AI. AI copied you. AI
That's right. That's right.
Writing.
That's right. Yeah. Okay. So just wrapping us up here, we talk about a lot. There's so much new technology coming out. There's all these questions about how to use this stuff effectively, what to use. There's entire groups of people who are just creating new apps and software every single day. Is there a place, like if I'm an organization and maybe I'm a small organization and I just need some resources or some help or some centralized information or something about technology and what I might want to use or not use, is there anywhere centralized that folks can go to just kind of get some help navigating this stuff?
We cover a lot of that. We really take an audience first approach in terms of what are the burning questions that nonprofit leaders have. And so we are always looking out for new tools that are coming to the market and learning how nonprofit leaders' peers are finding value in them, and sometimes maybe not finding as much value. But we do really try to keep our ears to the ground and pick up on these trends early in the process, so that we can share it and hopefully, give people something new to try.
Yeah. In addition to us, and like MJ said, we cover a lot of this. There's also a group called Fundraising.ai, and that's a consortium of people and organizations that look at how people are using AI in fundraising. And so I think that's a good place to start. And I believe the Giving Tuesday Data Commons also has some interesting studies and surveys, and even a message board where people can talk and interact and get information about how others are using AI in their fundraising.
Excellent. Thank you. Yeah. And I think I speak for a lot of folks when I just say we're really grateful for the work that you all are doing at the Chronicle of Philanthropy, and just kind of staying out ahead of all this stuff for the rest of us who we've got so much going on. And there's all this new stuff being thrown our way with the technology and everything. So yeah, we are really grateful for you all for just kind of keeping your ear to the ground, like you said, and staying on the forefront and kind of keeping us all informed of things we might not even know to look for. So thank you for that. Well, MJ and Rasheeda, thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you for your experience, expertise, and like I said, for the work that you continue to do out there. And we look forward to reading more of that work soon. So thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Absolutely. It's been a pleasure. We'll have to have you back because, you all are dealing with so much interesting stuff over there and are kind of ahead of the game. So we'll have to have you on again to just kind of keep us all up to date. And as always, thanks for listening to Sharp Insights. And if you found today's conversation helpful, please share it with your colleagues in the field and contact our Sharp team with any questions. Thank you for being a part of this conversation. Until next time, I'm Grant Miller. Thanks for listening. We hope today's discussion gave you practical takeaways to grow your plan giving program. To submit questions and topics for future episodes, go to sharpgroup.org or listen to us on your favorite podcast app. If you found this podcast insightful, be sure to like, review, and subscribe. Until then, stay sharp.